Well, thanks, Josh. I appreciate that introduction. Obviously, I've been drinking some of Mark's beer, so we're in good shape. All right, so this is my first slideshow that I've ever done in my entire life. I'm much more comfortable with cows or farm equipment than I am with computers. So bear with me. Here's a great picture that a gal took that came and did a short video that we're going to show representing local food producers in the North Fork Valley of Colorado. So let's see what happens. All right. Who is Wrich Ranches? We have my wife, Teresa, my son, Will, my daughter, Lexi, who just graduated from Regis University last weekend with a nursing degree. She was one of her friends that actually has a job to go to after graduation. The rest of them, like most college grads these days, went for the party, I guess, and have no career afterwards. So think about that with your taxpayers' dollars. And then, of course, the ugly guy on the right is me. So we're a conception to plate, registered Black Angus direct-to-consumer operation based in Crawford, Colorado. What does a direct-to-consumer operation mean? For us, it means that we are literally a conception to plate beef operation. Many of our fellow producers buy their calves, and they may finish them on grass. They may buy their calves and finish them on grain, but for us, we actually have the liability of the mother cows, so that way we know every single day in the life of those animals to ensure that they were fed the best feed, that they were cared for the best that they possibly could be, that they were loved every day, and they only have one bad day. Because for us, as animal producers, we have to honor every single life that we have, right? And that's the way that we're able to provide the highest quality beef that we possibly can, because we can control every single link in the chain. And actually what we're working on now is building our own processing facility, because that's the only thing that we outsource right now, is that we have a custom butcher that does custom butcher for us, and then we have a USDA facility that does USDA butcher for us as well. And so that's what a direct-to-consumer looks like for us. And that's one of those things that I preach to everyone. Go out and shake your rancher's hand so you know what kind of rancher you're dealing with. You might just be dealing with a beef pimp. So keep that in mind. All right, this is really going to be fun. Here's that little video I was talking about.
My name is Jason Wrich. My family and I run Wrich Ranches, registered Black Angus cattle, as well as Wrich Ranches grass-fed, grass-finished beef. We're located here in Crawford, Colorado, out on this beautiful plateau called Fruitland Mesa. One of our biggest focuses with Wrich Ranches is leaving a legacy. And because when we are gone, the only thing that's left behind is the land. And so we've spent a lot of time researching and developing irrigation systems, rotational grazing systems, to where you can improve the land. Every single year you want the land to be better than it was the previous year. That way you can leave it for your kids and or the next generation better than you found it. So the first thing that we did is we started to get very selective on where we grazed and how we grazed, and where we hayed and how we hayed. What I found through experimentation is a lot of the varieties of alfalfa and grass on this property will self-seed. If you allow them to go to seed, or if you allow them to go to full maturity and then harvest that hay at full maturity, you can actually plant by where you feed that hay new forage. And so that's one of those things I love to take people around and show them, that if you truly care and if you are willing to spend the time, I didn't have to spend any extra money, it was just simply time, that I'm going to leave that way better than I found it. A question that I'm asked quite often is, how do you not get attached to the animals? and I do every single one. All of our registered cattle have names that I've given them or our kids have given them because our kids own cattle of their own. They show cattle in 4-H, and so we have a real sentimental attachment to every animal. And part of that is we want to honor the animal by giving it the best life that it can, and then I personally load that animal in the trailer and take it to the butcher. And sure, I think about it, but I also think that we're going to use every part of the animal that we can.
Boom. Well, if you'll notice in that video, I had a thumb, which I don't have anymore. Man, this is working slick. I'm so happy.
Jinx it.
Missed your calling.
Okay. So a question that I get a lot is how do I get started, right? And this is one thing that is so hard about getting started in beef cattle and also just in agriculture at scale in general. So if you look at this slide, in my neighborhood, which is in Crawford, Colorado, on the western slope, beautiful place. We had a conference there last July. A few friends that were attendees are here today. Land purchase in my neighborhood is $10,000 to $16,000 an acre. The ranch next to me, which was 320 acres, just sold for $4.2 million. Do the math on that. Bred cows are currently selling at $2,400 to $3,000 a piece. Hay, which I'm having to buy right now because green up has been so late. It's been so cool. We had so much snow that instead of turning cows out on immature pastures and harming it for the first cutting of hay, we're keeping most of the cows penned up and feeding them. Pasture lease are everywhere from between $20 an acre to $30 an acre. Barbed wire fence, which I just got a bid to build a mile of fence, $25,000. And of course, all old cattle ranchers, fencing was their last priority. So I leased approximately 4,000 acres, and most of it has little to no fence on it. So I string between 13 and 26 miles of single strand or double strand electric fence to keep my cows contained and do our intensive rotational grazing. That is a lot of spools of polywire and thousands of posts. And then custom haying, if you pay someone to put up hay for you so you don't have to buy equipment, it costs about $120 a ton to have it put up. To put that in perspective, last year we raised 230 tons of our own, and so far I've bought about 65 tons of hay. So margins are super tight. That's why you have to get out and support your local rancher. Okay, so what does all that mean to me? A cow needs 30 to 35 pounds of forage a day. That equates to 40 acres of land. So this is unimproved native pasture, part of which is sub-irrigated that you can put up dry forage on. So that's how much land you need to raise one cow and one calf, which at the end of the year, you can sell that one calf for $1,200 at today's prices. Last year, that same calf would have sold for $850. So let's do the math on that. If you're going to buy cheap land, that's $10,000 an acre. That's $400,000 for 40 acres, plus a $2,400 cow, plus paying for custom haying to sell a $1,200 calf. Does that make sense to anyone? We own no land. We lease all 4,000 acres. That way, every single input is tax deductible, no matter what it is, right? So for us, we lease land. The math is quite a bit better, but it still doesn't make sense. But however, there are no barriers to entrance here, okay? So everybody that I talk to that wants to get into it, do you know what I tell them? Go find an old farmer or an old rancher whose kids have a job in town and they want nothing to do with the farm or ranch. Work for free for a year if you have to make that relationship. Because two of the biggest ranches that I lease, I went over and just volunteered helping the old timer because I heard he was sick. Come to find out he had cancer. So by the time he was getting ready to pass away, I had a relationship with his entire family, wife, kids, grandkids, and a relationship with his cattle. So before he passed away, I said, what is your plan for this land? What is your plan for your cows? He says, they'll probably just sell it. I really don't care. I'm like, well, how about if I lease all of the cows from you and I lease all of the land? He says, sure, write up a lease. I'll sign it. So I did. I did a separate lease for the cattle and a separate lease for each of his 3 properties based on what their production was. He signed it. So now, not only did I automatically double my herd with 35 more head of his cows that already knew the way. They've never been in a trailer. They would literally walk from the lowest pasture in the winter to the next pasture in the spring to the next pasture in the summer, and they will walk home on their own. That first winter that I was in charge, I was freaked out, right? And I get a phone call from the widow. Hey, the cows have started coming home. And I'm like, what do you mean? Sure enough, they're in the corrals waiting to be turned out of the corrals. They'd walked 3.5 miles down the county road on their own, made a right-hand turn and went in to the Hildebrand place, which is the middle ranch, which just blew my mind. So what did I do? I merged my cows with those cows the next year and allowed them all to learn from each other on where to go, where the ponds were, where the fences were, where the salt licks were. So now it's all one big herd that moves together. But there are opportunities out there. You just have to be willing to put yourself out there. So that's what I tell everyone's like, well, how do I get started? Number one, you might have mommy or daddy that have a ton of money to just pour on you because they screwed you up so bad by their parenting, right? Or you can do it the way that I did and truly bootstrap and put yourself in that situation for success. Okay. The other thing too is where there's a will, and this is my son Will, where there's a will, there's a way. Lease, lease, lease. I have friends of mine that have truck gardens, right? Has everybody heard what a truck garden is? They do farmers markets, all of that stuff. They leased 1 acre of productive irrigated land and they planted it in vegetables. And they started to go all the farmers markets. They're making $130,000 net off of 1 acre of vegetables. So opportunity is out there. You just got to put yourself out there. For me, I'm not buying any hard fence. I just buy more electric fence and more solar chargers because all of that infrastructure is mine. Whereas if you put it in, inevitably, if I build new fence around a new property, I typically lose that lease within the next year because the value of the lease goes up now that it's all perimeter fenced. So in lieu of spending a bunch of time and money on someone else's property, I just keep putting the electric fence back up after the elk rip it down. And of course the cows figure out they shouldn't be where they are. And so when I'm walking up there and I yell at them and they look up at me and they walk back through the fence and I string it back up, put it back up, turn the fencer back on, they know, right? Because they're like 1,400-pound kids. They know when they aren't supposed to be out of the yard. And so then that leads us to value added. If I was selling $1,200 calves, there's no way I could survive. So that's why we started selling registered Angus bulls and selling direct-to-consumer beef, which I actually bought some steaks and some of our primal ground beef or primal blend, and also some pork lard, rendered lard from our pastured pigs, if anybody's interested in buying some after this. So value added. You always have to be thinking, like right now, the highest profitability in beef is jerky and meat sticks, right? Because you can take an old cow or an old bull, grind it up and make it into jerky or meat sticks and sell it for $14, $16, $18 a pound, right? Whereas ground beef, premium $8, $8.50. I mean, sure, in Whole Foods you can see it as high as $11 a pound. And most of that's from New Zealand. So just so you know. And so I emphasize all portable infrastructure, to the point where I've started building portable calving barns. If I'm going to calve in a pasture where there are no trees, build a barn on skids that I could drag onto a trailer, haul to another farm or ranch, and drop off. I'm thinking about actually building one that I can remove an axle and put it up. And that way, if you have inclement weather or you have a cow that's having a problem where you may need to handle a calf, pull a calf, sick calf needs to be warmed up, you have all of this portable infrastructure that you own that you don't have to build on someone else's property. The other thing too is multi-species. You can run 3 sheep or 3 goats for every cow and not negatively impact the forage for the cow because they're eating different species of forage. And the bugs don't cross. So whatever let's say, because sheep get worms and people have to worm sheep, but cows don't get those same worms in the environment that we're in. So it's one of those things where you can have multi-species, or you can run pastured laying hens, or you can run broilers behind your cows because they scratch through the cow pies, eat all the maggots, and so you get eggs and or chicken, and you get the fly control all in one critter, which is, it works fantastic. I wish I could convince the landowners that it's okay for me to put chickens on some of those properties because they just don't want anything to do with chickens. I think they ate too much chicken when they were little, and just the sight of chickens turns them off. So I'm not going to push that. The other thing too is agritourism. I know so many people that are cramped in a cubicle or staring at a computer all the time or just looking for an excuse to get away. It's another fantastic way to make money is if you can get people out on your land, and it's great advertising. I love to show people what we do. I'm very passionate about what we do and why we do it and how we do it. And anytime I can bring someone out, talk to them about what we do, show them how we do it, show them what the land looked like before and what it looks like now, it's a slam dunk win-win. So where there's a will, there's a way. Now we'll shift to the Beef Initiative. Who in here has heard of the Beef Initiative? Okay. So 2 Novembers ago, a crazy cowboy messaged me on Twitter. His handle is Modern T Man, Texas Slim. And he said, "Hey, I heard about you through a mutual friend. What do you think about this?" And we launched together. Him, Cole of KNC Cattle, JP Valdez, who is the brains of the operation, myself, and Texas Slim started what we call the Beef Initiative. And what it is it's started as a website where any farmer or rancher could put their bio on there so we could connect more consumers directly with producers. And then it just went crazy from there. We've put on 6 conferences in the United States, and they put 5 conferences on in Australia already, just talking about sovereign food, which you have to have that to have health. Most importantly, sovereign money, which is where Bitcoin comes in, and then also sovereign health care, because food is medicine. It's one of those things that we've gone so far astray with hyper-processed grains and all of the subsidized row crop farms, and we've gone away from animal protein and properly raised animal protein that we literally are the sickest, most obese civilization on the continent right now. And we're one of the most wealthy, which is just, it breaks my heart, right? To see people who continue to just plod along, dying every day from the inside out because they're drinking their Diet Coke because it's good for you, and they're eating their heart-healthy bran muffin because it's good for you, right? Whereas so many people in my life that we have converted to an animal-based diet, not full carnivore, but animal-based, like choosing to eat the most dense food that you can, whole raw milk. We're fortunate to have a raw dairy near us. Real cheese, not American cheese. Beef, pork, lamb. Real raw eggs that haven't been washed still have the bloom on them, and they'll last on your counter for weeks. It's one of those things where you see how much better you feel when you start cutting out the seed oils, when you start cutting out that ultra-processed grains. And I mean, there's people that have cured their ulcerative colitis, gone off all of their diabetes medication. I mean, it is transformative, and it's easier than you think if you're willing to do it. My wife does almost all of the cooking in our house, but the Instapot and the Crock-Pot are our friends. I'll put in a roast, and I'll bury it in potatoes and carrots, and I go out to work, and when she comes home from work and when I come in, dinner is served. Luckily we raise our own beef, so we eat a lot of beef and cooked every way that you could imagine. It never gets old. I don't think I've ever had a dish that was like, oh, we're having meatloaf again, or we're having stew again, or we're having Asian beef, or we're having sloppy joes, we're having tacos, spaghetti, whatever. And now, I mean, they make gluten-free noodles if you want, or you can use squash noodles. I mean, it's one of those things where you can choose to not eat all that ultra-processed food if you don't want. So you can buy beef on the Beef Initiative. They've shipped to all the lower 48 states. Holy Cow Beef and KNC Cattle are the only two that are currently shipping through them. But all of the ranches that are in Colorado that are part of the Beef Initiative are on there. You can go to beefinitiative.com producers. And one of the biggest things that I am trying to get people to do is find their ranchers that are struggling, because this is an opportunity for them to have another revenue stream if they're willing to save some of those steers back, not just sell them on the conventional market, finish them however they want, as long as they disclose that, whether it's on grain, byproducts, or just grass, because ours are all grass fed and finished. There's no grain ever in their lives. And get them to sign up for the Beef Initiative. Right now, there's over 150 ranches all over the United States that are part of the Beef Initiative. And hopefully we're going to do another conference at our ranch this summer. We already did all the work to get it cleaned up for the one last year, so it shouldn't be as much work this year. Because I am like my grandfather and his father before him, I might use that thing someday, whether it's the tractor part or the used fenced post or whatever it happens to be. So I had to let a lot of things go in my life to put on the conference. And of course, the Beef Initiative is the information for all things beef. Right now, we're working on a standard operating procedure for opening a new processing facility. We have all kinds of health resources on there as far as like Crowd Health, which is a Bitcoin-based, crowd-funded healthcare. There's lots of great resources on there from doctors that are preaching the language of animal protein, functional medicine doctors. So it's just a great resource. Oh, now the hot button topics. mRNA for cattle. Who's heard of that? So there is not an mRNA vaccine approved for use in cattle. But as we well know, as strong as a pharmaceutical company are, and the motivation of them to make more money, it's amazing what they'll do to us and manipulate our thoughts about it, and oftentimes slide it in under the radar because they're telling a huge feedlot that we can improve your profitability if you use this vaccine. But that's why you have to go shake your rancher's hand and buy directly from the rancher, because we actually are using no vaccines in our cattle this year. We just branded last weekend, and we do freeze branding. We don't do hot branding. We use a chilled brass iron and freeze brand, and it's amazing what it does, because it actually just changes the pigment in the hair. So when it grows back in, it changes the hair white. So on our black cattle, it's very easy to identify which ones are ours, because they just happen to have this on their side. So, so there are no organizations supporting it, whether it's NCBA, RCAF, U.S. Cattlemen's. None of those beef organizations are saying that they support it or they're going to use it. So that's good news. And And like I said, we're using no vaccines in our cattle, which all of my conventional cattlemen friends are freaked out. They're like, well, what happens if your calves get sick and they all die? What I told them is it all comes down to management. If you don't make them graze right to the dirt, if you don't move them regularly, if they have exposure to kinds of stresses, whether it's barking dogs, whether it's traffic, all of those things, if they don't have those stresses, then their health stays up just like humans. Like for me, when I am out walking a fence line, fixing fence, I am totally zen. There's not a whole lot that can bother me other than a 650-pound black bear coming down the fence line at me. That's about the only thing that can get my heart pumping. So they're chill, and we handle them all the time. We're in them all the time. We're moving them pastures every 1 to 3 days, and so they see humans. They aren't threatened by it, and so actually when we go to the butcher, they think they're going to another property or another pasture, or if they're bulls, they think they're going to be turned out with their girls, which they're motivated for that. Whereas they walk out, they walk into the butcher facility, they look around like, shit, this isn't, and then that's it. That's literally lights out. So and you could tell it in the meat, because the animals that have been ran around a corral to be loaded, the meat's tough, oftentimes gamey, and you can really tell in the meat. And so that's one of those things where if your rancher's doing it right, you should never have any problems. Okay, what about mandatory country of origin labeling? Has anybody heard of that? Okay, so in 2015, the the International Trade Organization decided, because they'd been lobbied by Mexico and Canada, that the mandatory country of origin labeling law greatly hurt their finances, because they had to be labeled. Like when beef came up from Mexico, it had to be labeled product of Mexico. Beef came down from Canada, it had to be labeled beef from Canada. So right now, as long as the final packaging is done as the United States, it's labeled as product of the USA. The only product on any shelves anywhere in this country is beef, that you can do that. Everything, my shirt, it has to be labeled where it was actually made, right? So right now, we have a stranglehold on U.S. farmers and ranchers because they can't get the premium price because they're competing with Brazil, Canada, Mexico, all of those low-income, low-input countries south of us. And if you look at New Zealand, 90% of our grass-fed and grass-finished beef in Whole Foods comes from New Zealand. And so they say the reason that they do that is because they can't get American producers to have enough consistency in their product. Well, White Oak Pastures processes 3,500 beeves a year. So you figure you could have pretty good consistency on the same genetics over 3,500 head. So obviously they're lying. And if you look at the purchasing agreements, it's because they're getting it for half the price of what U.S. producers should get for it. So it all comes down to money. Our national beef organizations import all of this lean trim to blend with the fat that they trim off of feedlot cattle. And so we're importing like 1.4 billion pounds of lean trim to mix with our obese cattle that we're feeding in a feedlot, which shouldn't produce that much fat anyways. And that's their excuse. Whereas if we kept all of that beef in the United States and fed them the way that they were meant to be fed, I mean, because they're ruminants, they're meant to eat grass. They're meant to eat, lignin rich. I mean, my cows love to eat willows and thorns and anything that they can find because they know what they need to eat. But we're importing 1.47 billion and we're exporting 1.47 billion pounds of all the premium cuts. So we leave more of the garbage here and grind it into hamburger and feed it to our kids because that goes straight into the school lunch program. and it goes straight into all your fast food chains. And then we're exporting the ribeyes, the T-bones, the porterhouse, the tomahawks to all of our developing middle-class countries like South Korea, Japan, China. And so you look at, well, how does that work? Well, because JBS owns all of those cattle that they're importing, and they also own the feedlots and all the processing facilities that's exporting that super high quality beef. So they're getting it on both ends. They're making money on the lean trim coming in. They're making money on the discount, because if you sell your cattle on the grid and they have too much back fat, they actually dock you for what they pay you, what the packer pays you, and then they take all of that fat, all that back fat, they blend it with their own lean trim, and then make money through government subsidies, shoving it right down the school lunch program. So if you look at just how corrupt and how broken that system is, I mean, it disgusts me. It makes me motivated to want to go shake my rancher's hand, right? And I can't preach that enough. Go find someone that's doing it the way that you want it done and support them so they can continue to do more. And you'll also notice the difference in the taste and the texture and all of that. I mean, really, you can tell the difference. Let's see. Well, greenhouse gas, war on animal protein, we can go on and on and on about that. The methane and the carbon that's emitted by cattle is already part of the biological system of the ruminants that were here before. Before it was cattle, it was bison, and they estimate there are 2.5 times as many bison in the United States as there currently are cattle. And so if you look at that from a standpoint of greenhouse gas emissions, we're not even close to that. The biggest difference is the row crop agriculture, synthetic fertilizer, diesel fuel. That's the biggest contributor as far as agricultural emissions. That's why we use organic chicken litter if we're going to use any fertilizer, and we move our cows all the time so they poop and pee all over in different places of the ranch so we don't have big piles to spread. Right to farm. So Governor Polass just signed a right to repair order because the big equipment manufacturers were holding the rights to be able to repair your own tractors and troubleshoot any of the systems on them. So the only way that you could repair your own tractor was if you had a licensed dealer with their software to be able to troubleshoot the navigation systems as well as the operation systems on your tractors. And of course, so it was just another market capture. And so luckily we passed legislature in this state that allowed the farmers to repair their own tractors. And 3 years ago, we also did the Herd Shares Act. So I can actually custom slaughter or slaughter on farm and sell direct to consumer. Whereas before, it had to go through a USDA facility to be able to do that. And of course, most USDA facilities, after they kill it and skin it, they spray the whole thing down with citric acid. Luckily, there's ways to get around that. It takes a whole bunch of paperwork, but we're doing that with our USDA cattle. We had to sign an affidavit that we realized that the packer was not responsible if anybody ever got sick from eating our beef, which is bogus, right? Because honestly, if the animals are well cared for, they're not harboring any junk at all whatsoever. And that's the other thing too, is I get all of the livers back because the liver tells the story of the animal, and a clean liver that has no spots and no cysts means that it's had a good life and it's never been sick, because it all ends up in the liver. And of course, I have a lot of people that eat a lot of liver, and so I want to make sure I get all the liver back so I can feed all those people that are hardcore liver eaters. And then just a side note is Colorado is a fence-out state. It is an open range state. What that means is if you don't want cows on your property, you have to have adequate fence to keep them out. It's actually not the livestock owner's responsibility. However, comma, bulls is the livestock owner's responsibility, and stud horses are, and all sheep are the livestock owner's responsibility. So obviously the rule was written by cattlemen because, I mean, it was based in the range wars that happened in the infancy of this state. So, but that's just something to know, that if cows are out or if cows are in your flowers, it's actually the landowner's responsibility. I mean, for me, I want to be a good neighbor, and I always try and keep my fences up because my cattle are valuable. And many of them, if in that movie you saw some of them had halters on, those are my kids' show cows that they had halter broke, which we still have. There's a couple of them. The only way I can get them in a trailer is to go out in the pasture, call them by name, put a halter on them, and lead them in the trailer because they won't get in on their own, which is good and bad, because if they're all out, I can go get her and put a halter on her and walk, and then everyone else just lines out and follows her wherever it is that we need to go. So kind of goes both ways. Her name is Herusius, which is a made-up god name that my son made up because he was big time into that, because he has Athena and Hermione something and Herusius. So anyways. Okay, now it's open for questions. Hammer me.
All right, so for this foreign importation of beef, this fraudulent labeling, I want to hear your thoughts about this, because I thought about this. I think that the solution would be to create a private label and then put a private label and sell the label to other ranchers.
So there's actually Grass-Fed Cooperative is in the throes of that now. They contacted me because it's a third-party certifying group is what it's going to be. So they're going to come and certify your property and your cattle to fit into this. And so that's exactly what that is. The problem with labeling, period, like USDA labeling, is it's so much greenwashed bullshit that you can say, for instance, I went into Sprouts and I'm looking at all their regenerative ground beef labels. This one is Cargill. This one is JBS. This one is National Beef. They've made regenerative labels, big, fancy, pretty labels that they are using to sell under their parent companies. So a label is only as good as the honest person behind it, which is, again, why I preach, shake your rancher's hand. You got to go out and put in the sweat equity.
That would eventually come out. The honesty would eventually come out in the label.
It doesn't. It's driven by money. I mean, I have friends of mine, like they are also grass-fed and finished beef producers that buy my sick calves at the sale barn. Because if I ever treat a calf with anything, antibiotics, anti-inflammatories, as soon as it's well, I get rid of it. They buy those calves, finish them on grass, and sell them as premium, antibiotic-free, all-natural beef. And I know that that's not right because it has my freeze brand on the side of it, and it's literally on the other side of the fence from me. So you're only as good as the honesty of the rancher, and that's why you have to be able to ask those hard questions to whoever it is that you're interacting with.
Of the 150 or so ranches that are members of the Beef Initiative, do you have any personal favorites that you recommend here around Denver? True, but around Denver.
There aren't any around Denver, actually. Sacred Song Farm is in Mancos. I'm over on the Front Range. Those might be the only two that are in Colorado.
You still deliver to Denver, though, don't you, Jay?
Yep, we come to Denver once a month
okay.
when we're butchering, which won't be till this fall, because the steaks that are in that cooler are the last steaks other than my wife's personal stash, which I could not get into.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, but we deliver to the Front Range once a month, September through April, pretty much, because that's when we're butchering. But right now, I'm taking deposits for our fall butcher to lock in at a lower price, because with what we're seeing is inflation and everything else, I'm thinking that we're going to end up being higher when it's actually time to start butchering. And so we're going to end up having to raise the prices this fall. So, great question.
Do you have plans for the future when the federal government mandates unethical practices that you outlined here, like vaccination and the like, to stay clear of that?
Yeah. So I did 4 years in the Marine Corps, and we did some stuff and saw some stuff that proved that you can do almost whatever you want as long as you don't poke the bear. So much of what we're doing is parallel to regulation already. And with me delivering and not selling through any retailers, there's none of that red tape. And in transacting on chain with Bitcoin, you know, they can stick whatever sales tax, regulation, all of that stuff. You know what I mean? And that's one of those things that my wife would be jerking my chain right now, right? Keep the dog on the chain. I am one of those guys that anytime anyone ever says, you can't do that, and my mother will attest to this, from the time that I could walk, as soon as someone said, you can't do that, my response is always challenge accepted. And that's why I'm not looking to expand. I'm looking to strengthen the numbers that we're at on the land mass that we are on, because inevitably when you get bigger, your focus changes, and what you do when nobody's looking is always in peril of you making the wrong decision. And so for me, with where we're at, it's very easy for me to always do the right thing, no matter how painful it might be.
Jason, I love your beef, man, and the way you treat your animals. Good on you. But the question I have is, why is there such a strong ideological alignment between certain ranchers and Bitcoiners? I have a theory, and that is that, and it actually segues perfectly now, Bitcoiners like to say that, and maybe as a rancher, is it that, and especially as a small rancher, do you get a lot of like gray hairs from people coming to you with laws and regulations and requirements? You're like, I just want to grow my cows. Kind of like with Bitcoin, I just want to have my savings. Is that?
That's totally accurate. You know, and that's the thing is, when I was first introduced to Bitcoin, it almost brought me to tears, because I mean, I've worked on a fishing boat in Alaska. I've been a wildlands firefighter. I was in the Marine Corps for 4 years. I was an underground coal miner for 15 years. I got crushed in the mines, broke both my legs, spent 6 months in a wheelchair. You know, I amputated my thumb 3 years ago building fence. And ranching is the hardest job I have ever done in my life, because there are so many things out of your control, right? I mean, the weather, sickness in calves, the neighbor's bull getting in and breeding cows out of sync with your breeding schedule, you know, the price of hay, irrigation, water. There's just so many things that you can't control, right? And it's the same thing with fiat financials, right? I mean, if you look at these variable rate mortgages and all of this stuff that they're just ramming down your throat, whereas Bitcoin is the life raft from that. This is something I can have control over. I can hold my own keys, and even if you put a gun to my head, they are still mine, right? And so my life raft and my savings are safe. That's something I can control. And and I preach that to everybody who will listen to me, and many people who won't.
What are all the animals that you guys raise and sell? Because I know beef and hogs, and then what else do you guys do?
That's it. So we raise beef cattle, and then we have pastured pigs. We raise CUNY cross pigs, and actually mainly I'm totally bogarting most of the pork myself, because we have been eating a lot of beef, and now we have opportunity to eat some pork. So, but One of the cunis that we butchered was there was like, I think there was 30 pounds of trimmed fat because they're lard pigs. That's what they were made for. So we rendered it and jarred it. Anyways.
You mentioned that you are looking into starting a processing plant, and you sort of mentioned that the current processors wash the meat with citric acid, which doesn't sound bad to me. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Great question. So one of the biggest struggles with Americans is inflammatory response to their surroundings and to their food. And so anytime that you are introducing anything that you don't need, whether it is ultra-processed grains that are totally inflammatory, many plants, vegetables are inflammatory. The reason for that for us is I want to honor the animal and I want to provide the best meat to my consumers. And so anything that anyone else is adding, especially because of government overreach, ruffles my feathers. You know what I mean? Because we're kind of going further and further and further away from that ourselves with everything that we do. And the other thing too is there's been a couple of studies that the efficacy is asinine. Like they can't prove that it actually does anything other than makes the USDA inspector happy. So, and it gives them a crutch for improper meat handling, because that's essentially what it is. Like in the event that you splash some, gut material or blood on the outside of the carcass, this gives them an opportunity to wash it off versus just using regular tap water, which is already chlorinated, which would do the same thing. So that's how we see it.
What do you think are the biggest challenges over the next decade? We see a lot of anti-meat propaganda and anti-Bitcoin propaganda as well, coming from the World Economic Forum and all the greenwashing and all that sort of thing. So what do you think are going to be the challenges over the next decade that you'll have to deal with?
Well, probably one of the biggest things that is a fear is wolves in this state. I've went and toured some wolf kills in Wyoming, and it is the most gruesome, hideous, bloodbath, wasteful animal predation I've ever seen, because oftentimes they are playing. This pack of wolves, there was 9 wolves in this pack. They got into 16 fat steers. They only killed 2 of them. The rest of them, they got down and ate their hinds out while they were still alive. And that really scares me because we introduced them because unfortunately we had a whole bunch of uninformed voters that didn't realize what the financial recourse was going to be to farmers and ranchers. And that really scares me. And we essentially did that to ourselves. And that's partly because ranchers are not good at telling their story. And so when you have a group that's well organized and well funded saying, it will be fine, they were part of nature anyways, and then the reality is their breeding has exceeded their projections by 4 times. So they were projecting that they would be lucky to have 1 wolf survive per litter. And right now, the breeding pairs that they're watching have 6, 7, and 9. So if you look at it from that standpoint, it's going to be a rough row to hoe.
So you said you're first generation in ranching. So if you can talk about what prompted you to do this hardest job you've ever done. And also, you said you get these questions from people all the time asking about, how do I get started? Can you maybe share some experience of people who've been successful or maybe some failures as well?
For sure. So my grandfather grew up on a little sheep ranch in the San Luis Valley. His parents lost it in the Depression. They bought the original Home 40 back from the county because the bank couldn't even pay the taxes. And he moved to Olathe, which is a little town out there in western Colorado. So I had exposure to his little farm. And watching him and listening to him, not realizing just how important the information that he was imparting on me was, because they didn't have vaccines. They didn't have antibiotics. They didn't have synthetic fertilizer. It was everything that you could do with your own hands or your team of horses. And so I learned a lot from him, and I caught the bug. I didn't really know it at the time. And so when I met my wife, who was my high school sweetheart, and her parents owned a cattle ranch, it was like, well, this is perfect. But we kind of went in a roundabout way. I mean, we've only lived on the place for 7 years now. I've been farming it for 15. So while I was still working at the mine, I was taking care of it, farming it, fixing lots and lots of broken stuff. And so that's how I got started. And we started with the idea that we were only going to be selling registered Angus bulls because they can go for big money. I mean, the top selling bull sold for $1.4 million 2 years ago. And we've had some successes with genetics that we're working on, but that market is so cyclical, just like the cattle market. So that's when we started going into direct-to-consumer beef. We raised one for ourselves, shared it with friends and family, and they're like, this is best beef we've ever had. So we're like, oh, well, maybe we're, onto something. Most new start cattle ranches only last 6 years. So this is industry-wide, because when you're doing a Schedule F tax return and you have like the basis of your business, because what happens is by the time you get to that length of time, you've either pissed away all of your cash reserves trying to figure it out, or you've figured it out and you're expanding, right? Well, fortunately for me, there was no cash to start with, so it had to work, right? So I had to innovate and hustle and hustle and hustle and innovate. And the Bitcoin community is some of my strongest supporters for multiple reasons. Of course, we can transact in Bitcoin, but they get it. They understand what a sovereign individual means and how important that is. And then when they start eating our beef, they feel better. There's a connection there. And that's, I promote, you have to eat stuff that's grown in the soil that you walk on, and it's breathed the air that you breathe. There's been a bunch of crazy hippie studies, me included, of what our microbiome truly is. It's way bigger than us. It's all of the organisms around us. It's the air, the soil, the land, all of those things. And so if you're eating meat that is produced locally, you have this health benefit that you didn't even realize until after the fact. Because if you go to the grocery store, that beef was born on a farm in, let's say, Missouri. It went to Kansas to be backgrounded. So that's from weaning to about 950 pounds. And then maybe it went to Five Rivers up here in Greeley, or it went down to Texas to a feedlot to be finished from 900 to 1,450 pounds. From there, it got on another truck and then went to the kill facility. What they do at the kill facility is they kill it. They oftentimes cut it into boxed. So that it'll be like 6 boxes. One beef will fit in 6 boxes. And then it will go to a finished cut facility, or it'll go to a grocery store where they'll actually cut all the final cuts off of it. So typically a beef has 1,250 miles on it before you eat it. So if you look at the exposure to the air in every place that it was, the amount of fecal matter it inhaled in the feedlot that it was in, how much stress it was exposed to. I mean, it's a lose. That animal had a shit life. It's like a kid in foster care over and over and over again till you kill it. Whereas for ours, I mean, from the time that I turn the bulls out, literally conception to plate, we know every day in the life of those animals. So, I mean, it's hard. And there's times sitting around the kitchen table where we don't know where the next bill's getting paid. But God helps us, and we always make it.
What are you doing, and how are you thinking about adding resiliency to your operation, whether that's more income streams or resilience to your cattle when it comes to health? Like, how do you think about that process, and what are your active plans?
So the biggest thing is management. So we manage our cattle to where they never graze pastures too short. That way they're not eating dirt, they're not eating their own poop, all of that stuff. That's like the biggest thing. It starts with management. Then for us, if we ever have a cow that loses a calf for any reason, I calved out 10 first calf heifers. 8 of them were perfect. 2 of them went out in the deepest snow, had the calf in the snow, calf froze to death. I butchered those heifers, right? Because if they're too dumb to not go in the trees where I had spread straw out for them to have babies in the straw where it's warm and protected, then I'm going to fill my freezer. So anytime that happens, and that builds resiliency. The other thing too is when we're backgrounding our bulls, when we're raising our bulls to sell, we don't feed them any grain. So the ones that do really well just on forage, we know have the genetics that have the resiliency as well as to be able to make grass into high quality beef. And so those are the bulls that we raise and save for us. And then we also do quite a bit of artificial insemination. So I'm looking and touring at herds that background their bulls the same way that we do, that are looking for the traits that can survive 10,000 feet elevations and big snow weather. So that's one of the other things. Right now we're working on doing glamping on the ranch, tent camping with fancy mattresses and all that stuff. The problem is my mother-in-law put all of our ranch in conservation easement in the late 90s when they first came out. And it is so restrictive that it's almost to the point where it may not be profitable. So we've been in negotiations back and forth with the land trust. I would say the only way that you want to ever put land in conservation easement is number 1, if you have more money than sense, or number 2, if you want the next generations to be poor, because that really limits what you can do with that ground. So that's one thing that we're working on. We were hoping to have it by mid-month, this month, like up and running, but we're still in negotiations with the land trust.
I know a bunch of people don't give a shit if it's legal.
Yeah. Well, and that's what I told my wife too. So,
Can't count, I'm telling you.
yeah, there you go.
So over here, you mentioned onboarding small farms that are producing meat at local farmers markets. I have a bookkeeping business and I'm helping to onboard businesses to Bitcoin. Curious if you have an ambassador program or any ways of current material to help someone to be able to help onboard farmers that they're already visiting at farmers markets so they understand what you're offering here.
And so we were supposed to have a page on our Beef Initiative website. I actually looked at it before we went on because we were putting together a Bitcoin for ranchers, like program, like break it down Barney style, and it's not there. So I'm not sure what happened there. I think the gal that was supposed to do it maybe decided she'd had enough with Slim. I don't know. But yeah, so that was something that we were planning on doing, which I guess maybe we could work together on that. But yeah, thank you.
2 more questions.
Okay.
So I was wondering, this might be related to this last question. Do you have any tips or strategies on how to successfully orange pill ranchers and farmers and yeah?
I have had some successes, and oftentimes it comes down to, Mark and I were talking about this. Essentially, it comes down to educating people on the current financial system and how not resilient it is and how much exposure they have using it, to the point where they then are like, well, what's your answer? I mean, I'm a solutions-based thinker. So that's when you're like, well, we have a lifeboat that you can use, and this is how it works, and this is how simple it is to transact. At our bull sale 2 years ago, I was talking about Bitcoin with another young consigner, and the little old lady across the aisle from us said, "Oh, so you know about that Bitcoin?" "Yes, ma'am, I know a little bit about it." She's like, "Would you be willing to come and talk to our investment group about Bitcoin?" I'm thinking, oh man. But it was cool. It was like 12 ladies, ages 67 to 90. And they each put in $10,000 and they play with it in investments, right? They're like, well, let's play this, let's play that, whatever. So what I did is I emailed out Satoshi's white paper to all of them. I forwarded it. I was like, this is your homework, read this, bring your questions, right? And it was fantastic because they all cooked food. It was like a meal gathering, you know, and obviously I'm a big fan of food. So we talked through this. We'll come to find out, I mean, there was like a third ranchers, a third small business owners, and a third of them were retired bank presidents. So they knew like transaction fees and international trade, financial, and just how broken and how long that takes and how expensive it is to do that. I'm like, well, let's do this. Everybody open up your phone, get out your smartphone, download a Moon Wallet, and we're going to do this like click, boom, you know, everybody. I mean, and that's literally whatever amount that you want. And the fees at that time were nominal, nothing. Like I could send them $50 and it was like 3.5 cents, you know? And so they were like, the light just, poof, 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 you know, they saw that it is a tool. So that was awesome, but it's hard. And that's like me being the hippie farmer, the hippie rancher, which almost all of my buddies tell me that, because they're third, fourth, fifth generation. We've been doing it like this since we settled this land. You know, we've been successful enough to stay here, you know, you and your big ideas. But what I found out is most of them are so in bed with subsidies, USDA insurance, and they're living at a poverty level by using tax write-offs that all their Medicare, Medicaid. So if they made any more money, if they had any more success, then they'd have to pay for private insurance, and they're not willing to do that. And I'm just like, how sad is that? You have like the most noble profession that's just completely happy to live below the poverty level. They may have $50 million worth of land and equipment, but they're only making $40,000 a year, you know, and it's just, that blows my mind.
So in the regenerative space, it's usually seen that non-ruminant animals are very difficult to raise regeneratively, so like chickens and pigs. So pigs are often in the anti-seed oil community compared to a seed oil because of the high PUFA nature of the fat. So how do you guys raise your pigs differently, and have you guys tested it to see what your PUFA score is, essentially?
We haven't tested it. So our pigs live on pasture, and they actually prefer green grass over grain. The grain that we feed them is non-GMO corn mixed with bran and barley. We also have a relationship with the only brewery in Delta County, so we get all of their spent brewer's grains and feed that to our pigs as well. Pigs are another land tool because we put them in places where we're actually trying to completely flip the ecosystem upside down, whether it's in an old driveway, like literally I can put them in there and feed them on there, and they will turn that gravel up. And as you're adding hay and feeding them grain, they're just rejuvenating the soil. I can put them in our pens after we've taken the cattle out, and they can turn the whole thing over and turn the compost. And actually what we're getting ready to do now is put them in our woods so they can go in, because the cattle like to lounge under the trees. And because it's shaded and sheltered from the rain, it's dry. So you just have this layer of pine needles and cow manure that nothing grows there. So you put the pigs in there and they turn that whole thing up, and it's pretty amazing. So
That's our talk. Give it up for Jason.